The desert heat shimmered like a mirage as Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her combat gear one final time. The Afghanistan sun was merciless, beating down on the forward operating base with an intensity that made every piece of metal too hot to touch. She had been deployed for 8 months now, leading a communications unit in one of the most dangerous regions of Helmand Province. Maria came from a small town in Texas where her father worked construction and her mother taught elementary school. Military service ran in her family. Her grandfather had fought in Vietnam and her older brother had served 2 tours in Iraq. But Maria was different. She wasn't just carrying on tradition. She was proving something to herself and everyone who had ever doubted that a woman could excel in combat zones. At 26, she had already earned the respect of her fellow soldiers through her quick thinking and unwavering dedication. Her unit was responsible for maintaining crucial communication links between various outposts scattered across the mountainous terrain. Without their work, coordinated operations would be impossible, and lives would be lost. Commander Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison was a seasoned officer with 15 years of military experience. He had seen action in multiple theaters and was known for his tactical brilliance and genuine care for his troops. Harrison had initially been skeptical about having women in combat roles, but Maria had quickly changed his perspective. Her technical expertise and natural leadership abilities had made her one of his most trusted soldiers. The mission briefing that morning had been routine, or so it seemed. Intelligence reports indicated minimal enemy activity in the sector they were assigned to patrol. Their objective was to establish a temporary communication relay point on a strategic hilltop that would improve signal coverage for upcoming operations. The team consisted of 12 soldiers, including Maria and Commander Harrison. As they prepared to move out, Maria noticed something in Harrison's demeanor that seemed different. The usually confident commander appeared more cautious than usual, constantly checking and rechecking their route on the tactical maps. When she asked if everything was all right, he simply nodded and said that his instincts were telling him to be extra careful today. The convoy of 3 armored vehicles left the base just after dawn, winding through narrow mountain roads that had been carved into the rocky landscape decades earlier. The scenery was breathtaking in its stark beauty, jagged peaks rising toward a crystal-clear sky, ancient villages clinging to cliffsides, and valleys that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. Maria rode in the second vehicle with Harrison and 4 other soldiers. As they climbed higher into the mountains, radio chatter became increasingly important. She monitored multiple frequencies, coordinating with other units and keeping track of their progress. Everything seemed normal until they reached the designated hilltop location. The site was perfect, for their purposes. Elevated terrain with clear lines of sight in multiple directions and natural cover from rocky outcroppings. As the team began setting up their equipment, Maria felt a strange sense of unease. The area was too quiet, too perfect. In her months of deployment, she had learned to trust her instincts, and something about this place felt wrong. Harrison must have sensed it too because he ordered the perimeter guards to maintain extra vigilance while the technical team worked. Maria focused on establishing the communication relay, her trained hands moving efficiently through the complex setup process. The equipment was sophisticated and required precise calibration to ensure optimal signal strength and security. As she worked, Maria found herself thinking about home. Her mother had written recently about her father's retirement plans and how proud they were of her service. Her childhood friend Sarah was getting married next month, and Maria had promised to attend the wedding if her deployment schedule allowed. These thoughts of normalcy and home seemed so distant from the harsh reality of the mountain outpost where she now found herself. The morning progressed without incident, and the communication relay was nearly operational. Maria had just completed the final calibration sequence when she heard something that made her blood run cold: the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. Her military training kicked in instantly, and she shouted a warning to the rest of the team just as the first explosion erupted less than 50 meters from their position. The world exploded into chaos as mortar rounds began raining down on their position with deadly precision. Maria threw herself behind a boulder as chunks of rock and metal fragments whistled through the air where she had been standing moments before. The enemy had been watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike when the team was most exposed and vulnerable. Commander Harrison's voice cut through the thunderous explosions. as he shouted orders to his scattered troops. The attack was coordinated and devastating. Whoever was targeting them knew exactly where they would be and had prepared accordingly. This wasn't a random encounter with insurgents. It was a carefully planned ambush designed to eliminate the entire unit. Maria's training took over as she assessed the situation. The enemy fire was coming from multiple directions, suggesting a sizable force had surrounded their position during the night or early morning hours. The natural rock formations that had seemed like perfect cover now felt like a trap, limiting their options for escape or effective counterattack. Through her radio headset, she could hear desperate calls for backup and medical assistance. 2 soldiers had been injured in the initial barrage, and their cries for help added urgency to an already critical situation. The nearest friendly forces were at least 20 minutes away, assuming they could navigate the treacherous mountain roads without encountering additional enemy positions. Harrison moved with practiced efficiency, directing his soldiers to defensive positions while trying to coordinate a response. His years of combat experience were evident in every decision, but even his expertise couldn't change the fundamental reality. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in an exposed position with limited ammunition and no immediate prospect of reinforcement. Maria found herself separated from the main group, pinned down behind her rocky shelter as bullets sparked off the stone around her. She could see Harrison approximately 30 meters away, taking cover behind the communication equipment they had just finished installing. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very gear meant to save lives by improving coordination was now providing the only protection for her commanding officer. The intensity of the enemy fire was unlike anything Maria had experienced during her deployment. The attackers seemed to have unlimited ammunition and were using it to maintain constant pressure on the trapped soldiers. Every attempt to move or return fire was met with a devastating response that forced them back into cover. Through brief glimpses between rounds, Maria began to identify enemy positions. They were well concealed among the rocky terrain, using natural camouflage and carefully prepared fighting positions. The attack had clearly been planned for weeks, with the enemy conducting detailed reconnaissance of the area and anticipating exactly how American forces would utilize the strategic hilltop. Harrison's tactical radio crackled with updates from the base, but the news wasn't encouraging. The relief column was encountering resistance along the access road, and close air support was delayed due to mechanical problems with the helicopters. The isolated unit would have to hold their position and survive on their own for at least another hour. As the firefight continued, Maria noticed something that made her heart sink. Harrison was moving more slowly than usual, and she could see dark stains spreading across his uniform. He had been hit during the initial barrage but was continuing to command his troops despite his injuries. His dedication to his soldiers was absolute, even when it meant ignoring his own welfare. The wounded commander continued directing the defense, using hand signals and shouted commands to coordinate their limited return fire. His tactical brilliance was keeping them alive, but Maria could see that he was weakening with each passing minute. Blood loss and shock were taking their toll, even as he refused to acknowledge his condition. Enemy fire suddenly intensified around Harrison's position, as if the attackers had identified him as the key to breaking American resistance. Bullets sparked off the communication equipment and chipped away at the rocks providing his cover. Maria realized with growing horror that the enemy was systematically targeting her commander, trying to eliminate the leadership that was holding the defense together. The situation reached a critical point when a well-placed enemy grenade exploded near Harrison's position, destroying much of his cover and leaving him exposed to direct fire. Maria watched in shock as her wounded commander struggled to find new shelter, while bullets whistled around him. The man who had kept them all alive was now in mortal danger, and without him, the entire unit would likely be overrun within minutes. Every instinct told Maria to stay in her relatively safe position and wait for the relief column to arrive. Moving across the open ground between her shelter and Harrison's location would be suicidal. The enemy had clear fields of fire and had already demonstrated their accuracy. But looking at her wounded commander, struggling to stay conscious while enemy bullets closed in around him, Maria knew she couldn't live with herself if she didn't act. The next few seconds would determine not only Harrison's fate, but potentially the survival of the entire unit. Maria took a deep breath, checked her weapon one final time, and prepared to do something that would either save her commander's life or end her own. The moment that would become military legend was about to begin. Maria Rodriguez made a decision that defied every tactical manual and survival instinct she had ever learned. Without hesitation, she burst from her protective cover and began sprinting across the killing field toward her wounded commander. The distance seemed to stretch endlessly as bullets whined past her head and kicked up dust clouds around her feet. Time seemed to slow as she ran, her combat boots finding purchase on the rocky terrain, while her mind calculated angles, distances, and the precious seconds she had before enemy fire could adjust to her new position. She could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, mixed with the sharp crack of rifle fire and the deeper boom of explosions echoing off the mountainsides. Harrison looked up in shock as he saw Maria charging toward him, her face set with grim determination. He tried to wave her back, shouting warnings that were lost in the chaos of battle. But Maria wasn't stopping. She had made her choice, and nothing would deter her from reaching her commander. The enemy fighters were caught off guard by her sudden movement. They had been focused on maintaining suppressive fire on the defensive positions, not expecting any of the trapped soldiers to attempt such a desperate maneuver. Their surprise bought Maria precious seconds as they adjusted their aim and tried to track her rapid movement across the broken terrain. As she ran, Maria's military training kicked in completely. She moved in an irregular pattern, changing direction and speed to make herself a difficult target. Her months of physical conditioning in the harsh Afghan environment had prepared her body for this moment, even though nothing could have prepared her mind for the surreal experience of running through a hailstorm of bullets. Halfway to Harrison's position, a bullet tugged at her sleeve and another sparked off a rock inches from her left boot. The enemy had found their range and was beginning to concentrate fire on her position. Maria could see muzzle flashes from multiple locations, indicating that several fighters were now focused entirely on stopping her rescue attempt. Harrison struggled to provide covering fire despite his wounds, but his position offered limited angles for effective shooting. He watched with a mixture of admiration and terror as his young soldier continued her impossible sprint across ground that should have been certain death. Every step she took seemed like a miracle. Every second she remained upright defied the odds. Maria's lungs burned as she pushed her body to its limits, but she could see Harrison clearly now. The commander was worse off than she had realized. His uniform was soaked with blood and he was struggling to maintain consciousness. Shrapnel from the grenade explosion had torn through his protective vest, and he was losing blood at an alarming rate. With 10 meters still to cover, Maria felt the shock wave from a nearby explosion that nearly knocked her off her feet. The enemy was now using grenades and heavier weapons to stop her advance, turning the area around Harrison into a deadly zone of flying metal and concussive blasts. But she was too close to stop now. The final few meters passed in a blur of motion and adrenaline. Maria dove the last 5 feet, sliding behind the damaged communication equipment just as a concentrated burst of enemy fire shredded the air where she had been running. She had made it, but now both she and Harrison were trapped in an even more precarious position. Harrison looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and concern. His breathing was labored, and Maria could see that he was going into shock from blood loss. She immediately began applying first aid, using her medical training to assess his wounds and stop the bleeding. The commander tried to protest, insisting that she should focus on the tactical situation, but Maria ignored his objections. Working with swift efficiency, Maria used her emergency medical supplies to treat Harrison's most serious wounds. The shrapnel had caused significant damage, but none of the fragments had hit vital organs. With proper treatment, he would survive, if they could get out of their current situation alive. While administering first aid, Maria maintained constant awareness of their tactical situation. The enemy fire had lessened slightly, suggesting that the attackers might be repositioning for a final assault. She could hear movement in the rocks around them, indicating that the enemy was trying to close the distance and eliminate the trapped Americans at close range. Harrison's condition stabilized somewhat under Maria's treatment, but he remained weak and disoriented. He tried to resume command of the situation, but Maria gently but firmly told him to conserve his strength. For the first time in the battle, she found herself in the position of making life or death decisions for both of them. The communication equipment, though damaged, was still partially functional. Maria managed to establish contact with the relief column and provided their exact position and status. The rescue force was still 15 minutes away, but they now had accurate information about the enemy positions and could coordinate a more effective approach. As she worked the radio, Maria realized that her desperate rescue run had accomplished more than just reaching Harrison. By drawing enemy fire and forcing them to reveal their positions, she had provided valuable intelligence that would help the relief force neutralize the threat. Her act of courage had inadvertently become a tactical breakthrough, but their immediate situation remained critical. Enemy fighters were moving closer, and Maria could hear voices calling out in a language she didn't understand. The final phase of the battle was approaching, and she would need to find a way to keep both herself and Harrison alive until help arrived. With Harrison's condition temporarily stabilized, Maria took stock of their desperate situation. The damaged communication equipment provided minimal cover, and she could hear enemy fighters moving through the rocks, systematically closing in on their position. She had perhaps 10 minutes before they would be discovered and overwhelmed by superior numbers. Maria's mind raced through their limited options. The terrain around them offered few possibilities for escape, and Harrison was in no condition for rapid movement. She would have to make their current position defensible until the relief column could fight through the enemy roadblocks and reach them. It seemed impossible, but giving up wasn't in her nature. Working quickly and quietly, Maria began repositioning the scattered equipment to create better defensive cover. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had trained for exactly this type of situation, though nothing in her training had prepared her for the emotional weight of being responsible for her wounded commander's survival. Harrison drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling tactical observations or trying to take back command of the situation. During his lucid moments, he recognized what Maria was doing and attempted to help despite his weakened condition. His years of combat experience provided valuable insights even as his body struggled with blood loss and shock. The sound of approaching footsteps grew closer, and Maria could distinguish individual voices among the enemy fighters. They were being methodical in their search, checking every possible hiding place as they advanced. She estimated at least 6 fighters were participating in the sweep, all moving with the confidence of soldiers who believed they had their prey cornered. Maria checked her remaining ammunition and found the count disturbingly low. The firefight had consumed most of her combat load, leaving her with barely enough rounds for a sustained engagement. She would have to make every shot count and hope that accuracy could compensate for the vast numerical disadvantage she faced. Through the partially functional radio, she maintained contact with the relief column. The rescue force was encountering heavier resistance than expected, with enemy fighters using improvised explosive devices and prepared defensive positions to slow their advance. The timeline for rescue had extended to at least 20 minutes, time that Maria wasn't sure they had. Harrison suddenly grabbed her arm with surprising strength, his eyes focusing with clarity despite his injuries. He whispered tactical advice about the approaching enemy, pointing out likely avenues of approach and suggesting defensive positions. Even wounded and barely conscious, his military mind continued to function with remarkable precision. The first enemy fighter appeared between 2 large boulders approximately 50 meters away, moving cautiously but confidently toward their position. Maria held her breath and waited, knowing that firing too early would reveal their exact location to the other searchers. She needed to wait until multiple targets presented themselves and then eliminate them quickly before they could call for reinforcements. 2 more fighters emerged from different directions, and Maria realized they were facing a coordinated sweep. The enemy had learned from earlier encounters with American forces and was using proper small unit tactics to minimize their exposure while maximizing their chances of success. They were experienced fighters, not the untrained insurgents she had sometimes encountered during her deployment. With her finger on the trigger, Maria calculated angles and distances while monitoring Harrison's condition from the corner of her eye. The commander was struggling to remain conscious, but he had managed to position himself to provide supporting fire if needed. His determination to continue fighting despite his wounds was both inspiring and concerning. The tactical situation reached a critical point when the lead enemy fighter signaled to his companions, indicating that he had spotted evidence of their presence. Maria knew that within seconds the searching fighters would pinpoint their exact location and coordinate a final assault. The moment for action had arrived. Maria's first shot took down the lead fighter before he could raise an alarm, but the sound of gunfire immediately alerted the others to her position. The remaining enemy soldiers took cover and began maneuvering to surround their small defensive position. What had been a search operation suddenly became a close-quarters battle with no room for error. Harrison managed to engage one of the flanking fighters despite his weakened condition, his shot preventing an enemy advance that would have been devastating. But the effort left him even more drained, and Maria could see that he was approaching the limits of his endurance. She would have to carry the majority of the defensive burden. The enemy fighters showed impressive discipline and coordination, using fire and movement tactics to advance while maintaining suppressive fire on Maria's position. They clearly understood that time was on their side. The longer the engagement continued, the more likely additional enemy forces would arrive to tip the balance decisively in their favor. Maria found herself fighting the most intense combat of her military career, making split-second decisions that determined whether she and Harrison would survive the next few minutes. Every shot had to count, every movement had to be perfect, and every second brought them closer to either rescue or defeat. The radio crackled with updates from the relief column, reporting that they were finally breaking through the enemy roadblocks and making rapid progress toward the hilltop position. But Maria could hear additional enemy fighters approaching from multiple directions, suggesting that reinforcements were arriving faster than friendly forces could advance. The battle was reaching its climax, and Maria realized that the next few minutes would determine not only their survival, but potentially the outcome of the entire engagement. With Harrison barely conscious beside her and enemy fighters closing in from all sides, she prepared for the fight of her life. The intensity of the firefight reached a fever pitch as Maria found herself engaging multiple enemy fighters simultaneously. Her training and months of combat experience guided her movements as she shifted between firing positions, using every piece of cover available while protecting Harrison's unconscious form. The communication equipment that had started as their objective had become their fortress, though it was rapidly being destroyed by incoming fire. Maria's ammunition was running critically low, and she began making impossible choices about which targets to engage. Every bullet had to serve a purpose, either eliminating an immediate threat or forcing enemy fighters to take cover long enough for her to reposition. The mathematical precision required was overwhelming, but her military training had prepared her mind to function under exactly these conditions. Harrison stirred occasionally, managing weak shots when enemy fighters exposed themselves, but his condition was deteriorating rapidly. The blood loss and trauma were taking their toll, and Maria realized that even if they survived the immediate firefight, her commander needed urgent medical attention that wouldn't be available for precious minutes. Through the chaos, Maria could hear the distinctive sound of American helicopters approaching in the distance. The relief column had finally broken through and was bringing close air support to turn the tide of the battle, but the enemy fighters seemed to recognize this as their final opportunity and were pressing their attack with desperate intensity. A grenade exploded close enough to shower Maria with rock fragments, temporarily stunning her and leaving her ears ringing. She shook off the disorientation and immediately checked on Harrison, who had been knocked unconscious by the blast. His pulse was weak but steady, and she quickly repositioned him to better protect him from additional explosions. The sound of rotor blades grew louder, and Maria could see Apache attack helicopters cresting the nearby ridge. The cavalry was arriving, but the enemy fighters were making one final push to eliminate the trapped Americans before air support could intervene. Maria found herself in a race against time, holding off determined attackers for just a few more minutes. Enemy fighters began appearing from multiple directions simultaneously, coordinating their assault to overwhelm Maria's defensive position. She moved with fluid precision, engaging targets in order of immediate threat while maintaining awareness of Harrison's vulnerable position. Her marksmanship training proved invaluable as she made shots that seemed impossible under the circumstances. The first Apache helicopter opened fire with its chain gun, the distinctive sound of the 30mm cannon echoing off the mountainsides. Enemy positions that had seemed impregnable moments before were suddenly being devastated by precision fire from above. The tactical situation began shifting dramatically in favor of the trapped Americans, but the enemy fighters weren't finished. Several had managed to reach positions close enough to Maria's defensive perimeter that helicopter fire couldn't effectively engage them without risking friendly casualties. She found herself fighting a close-quarters battle, while helicopter gunships circled overhead, unable to intervene directly. Maria's final magazines were depleting rapidly as she engaged the remaining enemy fighters. Her movements became more economical, more precise as she realized that every wasted shot could mean the difference between survival and death. The mental calculation required was staggering, but her training held firm under the ultimate test. Harrison regained consciousness just as the firefight reached its climax, immediately attempting to provide support, despite his critical condition. His determination to continue fighting, even when barely able to hold a weapon, provided Maria with the emotional strength she needed to continue her seemingly impossible defense. The relief column's ground forces finally reached the base of the hill and began their assault up the rocky slopes. Maria could hear American voices shouting tactical commands and the familiar sound of M4 rifles engaging enemy positions. Help was finally close enough to matter, but she still had to hold her position for several more crucial minutes. A final enemy fighter managed to reach a position dangerously close to their defensive perimeter, armed with what appeared to be an improvised explosive device. Maria realized that this single determined attacker could eliminate both her and Harrison, even with rescue forces closing in. She made a split-second decision that would define the final moments of the battle. Leaving her protected position, Maria engaged the approaching fighter in direct combat, using her remaining ammunition, and then transitioning to hand-to-hand fighting when her weapon ran dry. The struggle was brief but intense, testing every aspect of her military training and personal determination. The sound of American voices grew closer as the relief force fought their way up the hillside, but Maria knew that Harrison's survival depended on the next few seconds. Everything she had trained for, everything she believed about duty and courage, came down to this final moment when she had to find strength she didn't know she possessed. As the battle reached its conclusion, Maria realized that her desperate decision to rescue Harrison had set in motion a chain of events that saved not only her commander's life, but potentially the lives of the entire unit. Her moment of courage under fire was about to become the stuff of military legend, though she remained focused entirely on the immediate task of keeping them both alive until the medics could take over. The relief force was seconds away, but those final seconds would determine whether her heroic actions would be remembered as a successful rescue or a tragic sacrifice. Maria prepared for whatever came next, knowing that she had given everything she had to save the life of a man who had earned her respect and loyalty through months of exemplary leadership. The relief force reached Maria's position just as she finished neutralizing the final enemy threat. American soldiers poured over the rocky defensive perimeter, their trained eyes immediately assessing the tactical situation and the condition of the two survivors. The contrast between the chaos of the preceding hours and the sudden arrival of overwhelming friendly support was almost surreal. Medics rushed to Harrison's side, working with practiced efficiency to stabilize his condition and prepare him for immediate evacuation. Maria watched with exhausted relief as professional medical personnel took over the care of her wounded commander, their advanced equipment and expertise providing treatment options that her field first aid could never match. The commanding officer of the relief force, Major Patricia Williams, approached Maria with undisguised amazement. The tactical situation she found defied easy explanation. A single soldier had held off a determined enemy force while protecting a wounded commander, accomplishing what should have been impossible according to every military manual and tactical doctrine. As the immediate medical emergency was addressed, details of Maria's actions began to emerge through interviews with the other survivors and physical evidence scattered across the battlefield. The enemy force had been significantly larger than initially estimated, and the defensive position had been far more precarious than anyone had realized during the heat of combat. Harrison regained consciousness during his medical treatment, his first words asking about Maria's condition and expressing gratitude for her actions. Despite his serious wounds, his primary concern remained the welfare of his soldiers, demonstrating the leadership qualities that had earned Maria's loyalty and motivated her desperate rescue attempt. The helicopter evacuation proceeded smoothly, with Harrison receiving priority medical transport to the nearest field hospital. As his stretcher was loaded onto the aircraft, he managed to catch Maria's eye and mouth a simple "thank you" that carried the weight of everything they had experienced together on that mountainside. Maria found herself struggling with the aftermath of the intense combat experience. The adrenaline that had sustained her through hours of life-or-death decisions was wearing off, leaving her physically and emotionally drained. The magnitude of what she had accomplished was beginning to sink in, along with the realization of how close they had all come to disaster. Over the following days, word of Maria's actions spread throughout the military command structure. Her superiors conducted detailed debriefings, trying to understand how a single soldier had managed to achieve what seemed tactically impossible. The rescue had saved not only Harrison's life, but had provided crucial intelligence that led to the elimination of a significant enemy cell. The official reports painted a picture of exceptional courage and tactical brilliance, but Maria remained focused on the simple reality that she had done what needed to be done to save a fellow soldier. The idea that her actions might be considered extraordinary seemed foreign to her. In her mind, she had simply fulfilled the basic obligations of military service. Harrison's recovery progressed steadily at the military hospital in Germany, where he underwent multiple surgeries to repair the damage caused by shrapnel and blood loss. Throughout his treatment, he spoke frequently about Maria's actions, ensuring that everyone who would listen understood the full scope of her heroism and the debt he owed to her courage. The story began to take on a life of its own as it spread through military channels and eventually reached the media. Maria found herself uncomfortable with the attention, preferring to focus on her continuing duties rather than discuss her actions during what she considered simply another day of military service in a combat zone. Military historians and tactical analysts began studying the engagement, using it as a case study in individual initiative and courage under fire. The rescue became required reading at military academies, though the focus on tactical details sometimes missed the human element that had made Maria's actions possible. Several months later, Maria stood at attention in a formal ceremony, as her actions were officially recognized with the Silver Star, one of the military's highest decorations for valor. Harrison, now recovered and returned to duty, had the honor of presenting the award, his words emphasizing not just her courage but the profound impact her actions had on everyone who served with her. The medal ceremony was attended by military leadership, fellow soldiers, and Maria's family, who had traveled from Texas to witness their daughter's recognition. Her parents' pride was evident, though they admitted they were only beginning to understand the magnitude of what their daughter had accomplished in that distant mountain battlefield. In her acceptance speech, Maria emphasized that her actions represented the values and training that every soldier receives, rather than any exceptional personal qualities. She dedicated the award to Harrison and the other soldiers who had served with her, deflecting attention from herself while acknowledging the team effort that had made their survival possible. Years later, Maria's story continued to inspire new generations of soldiers who faced their own moments of decision in combat zones around the world. The legend that began with a split-second decision to run across a killing field had become a permanent part of military history, demonstrating that extraordinary courage often emerges from ordinary people when circumstances demand everything they have to give. Harrison went on to have a distinguished military career, eventually reaching the rank of full colonel, before retiring to become an instructor at the Army War College. He never forgot the debt he owed to Maria Rodriguez, and her story became central to his teachings about leadership, courage, and the bonds that unite soldiers in combat. Maria herself continued her military service for several more years before transitioning to civilian life, where she became an advocate for veteran services and women in combat roles. The legend of her actions on that Afghan mountainside followed her throughout her life, though she remained most proud of the simple fact that she had brought her commander home alive when it mattered most.